I want you to imagine something for me. Imagine a small city, about 12,000 people. It has apartment buildings, office complexes, a hospital, a dental clinic, three dining facilities, two gymnasiums, a fire station, motor pools, warehouses, and about 47 separate structures that are all connected by an underground network of water mains, sewage lines, steam pipes, and gas conduits that were originally installed in 1953. Some of them were updated in the 70s, some in the 90s. Some of them were never updated at all. Now imagine that one single person is responsible for knowing every inch of that underground labyrinth, every valve, every junction, every patch job, every bypass, every section that's held together with nothing but a prayer and a custom fabricated coupling that doesn't exist in any manual. That person was me. My name is Dan Kowalski, Sergeant First Class, United States Army. Most 911C utilities equipment repairer, which is the Army's fancy way of saying I was a plumber. But not just any plumber. I was the plumber, the only senior qualified utilities NCO assigned to the Directorate of Public Works at Fort Granger, Georgia, for over 9 consecutive years. And before that, I spent 13 years bouncing between duty stations doing the exact same thing. Kandahar, Bagram, Camp Arishan, Fort Hood, Fort Bragg. I had laid pipe in 130-degree heat in full kit while mortars were landing 400 meters away. I had repaired frozen water mains at 2 in the morning in a South Korean winter so brutal that my wrench stuck to my hand when I grabbed it without gloves. 22 years. That's how long I had been doing this job. 22 years of crawling through tunnels, standing in wastewater up to my knees, reading blueprints that were older than my mother, and keeping the water running for soldiers who never once thought about where it came from when they turned on a faucet. Fort Granger was special, and not in the good way. It was one of those old Cold War era installations that the Army never fully modernized because it kept almost getting on the Iraq closure list, but never quite making it. So instead of getting a full infrastructure overhaul, it got band-aids, patches. Temporary fixes that became permanent. Workarounds that became standard operating procedure. The base water system was a Frankenstein's monster of 6 different decades of plumbing technology, and I was the only one who understood how all of it talked to each other. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. The blueprints in the DPW office were wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. Sometime in the 80s, a major rerouting project had been done, and whoever was in charge of updating the as-built drawings simply never did it. So the official plans showed water mains running under Building 40. 2, when in reality those mains had been rerouted under the parade field 20 years ago. The only accurate map of Fort Granger's underground utilities existed in one place, and that was inside my head. I also kept a personal set of hand-drawn diagrams in a green binder that I updated every time I did a repair or discovered something new. That binder was my Bible. My boss, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Hector Delgado, understood this. He had been the facilities maintenance officer for 4 years, and by his second week on the job, he figured out that the entire water infrastructure of Fort Granger basically ran on one man's institutional knowledge. He didn't like that. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he knew it was a vulnerability. He tried multiple times to get the Army to fund a full infrastructure survey and digital mapping project. Every request was denied due to budget constraints. So Delgado did the next best thing. He protected me. He made sure I had everything I needed. He made sure my team of 4 junior soldiers was properly trained on the basics. He shielded me from the bureaucratic nonsense that flows downhill in the military like raw sewage, and he listened to me when I told him something was about to break. Because I always knew. After 22 years, you develop a feel for it. A sound in the pipes that isn't quite right. A pressure reading that's half a PSI off from where it should be. A wet spot on the ground near Building 19 that shouldn't be there. I could feel that base breathing. I knew when it was healthy and I knew when it was sick. That was the world as it existed in March of that year. Functioning. Not pretty, not modern, but functioning. Because the right people were in the right positions and the chain of command understood that some things you don't mess with. And then Chief Warrant Officer Delgado got orders to PCS to Fort Liberty. And the Army, in its infinite wisdom, decided that his replacement would not be another warrant officer with years of practical experience. No, his replacement would be a freshly commissioned second lieutenant straight out of the basic officer leader course on his very first assignment with 0 days of practical experience in facilities maintenance, who had been given this posting because, and I quote, "I would be a good learning opportunity for a junior officer." His name was Second Lieutenant Tyler Ashford III, and I knew we were in trouble the moment I saw him step out of his BMW M in the DPW parking lot on his first day. He was 23 years old. He had a degree in business administration from some private university back east that I'd never heard of. He was tall, lean, had a haircut so fresh it looked like he'd gotten it in the parking lot 5 minutes earlier, and he walked with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who has never once been proven wrong about anything because they've never actually done anything. He was wearing a uniform so new it still had the creases from the packaging, and his boots looked like they had been taken out of the box that morning. I've seen a lot of new lieutenants in my career. Most of them fall into one of two categories. The first category is the humble ones. They show up, they find their senior NCO, they shake hands, and they say something like, "Sergeant, I'm new here. I've got a lot to learn. I'm going to rely on you to teach me how things work around here." Those lieutenants become great officers. The Army needs those lieutenants. The second category is the ones who show up believing that their commission makes them an expert on everything. They think that because they spent 4 years in college and 14 weeks in BLC, they now know more than the senior NCO who has been doing the actual job for 2 decades. Those lieutenants are dangerous. Lieutenant Ashford was not just in the second category. He was the poster child for it. I was in the mechanical room under Building 7, replacing a corroded check valve on a hot water recirculation line when my phone buzzed. It was Specialist Rivera, one of my guys, texting me. "New LT is here. He's walking around the shop asking where everything is. Looks like he's inspecting." I wiped my hands on a rag, climbed out of the access hatch, and drove my utility vehicle back to the DPW building. When I walked into the main shop, I found Lieutenant Ashford standing in the middle of the floor with a clipboard, literally counting tools on the pegboard. My 4 junior soldiers were standing off to the side, looking at me with the wide eyes of baby deer who have just heard a twig snap. I walked up to him. "Good morning, sir. I'm Sergeant First Class Kowalski. I'm the Senior Utilities NCO. Welcome to Fort Granger." He didn't look up from his clipboard. He finished writing something down, clicked his pen, and then turned to face me. He looked me up and down. I was dirty. I had pipe dope on my forearms. My uniform had water stains on the knees. I smelled like copper flux and PVC cement. He looked at me the way you might look at a stain on a restaurant tablecloth. "Sergeant Kowalski," he said, "you're the plumber, not the Senior Utilities NCO, not the Facilities Maintenance NCOIC. The plumber." I let it go. First impressions don't always mean everything. "Yes, sir," I said. "I handle all water, sewage, and steam utilities for the installation. I also oversee." He cut me off. "I've read the duty roster. I know what your role is." He paused. "I've also been reviewing the budget allocations for this directorate for the past 2 fiscal years." I felt something cold settle in my stomach, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was a tone in his voice that I had heard before, many years ago, from a battalion commander who had decided to cut the maintenance budget for our vehicle fleet by 40%. That decision resulted in 3 Humvees throwing transmissions during a convoy in Afghanistan and one of them blocking a road long enough for an ambush to be set up. 2 soldiers were wounded. That same tone, that same certainty, that same ignorance wearing confidence like a Halloween costume. Sir, I said carefully, if you'd like, I can give you a full briefing on the infrastructure status. I have detailed notes on every system, including some critical repair projects that Chief Delgado and I had prioritized for this quarter. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. That won't be necessary right now, Sergeant. I have my own assessment process. I'll be conducting a full review of operations, staffing, and expenditures over the next 2 weeks. I'll let you know if I need anything from you. And he walked away, just like that. No questions about the systems. No questions about the base. No questions about what keeps 12,000 people supplied with clean water every single day. He walked into his new office, closed the door, and started his review. For the next 11 days, I barely saw him. He was in his office with the door closed, or he was in meetings with the garrison commander's staff. He never once came down to the shop to talk to my soldiers. He never once asked to see the utility tunnels. He never once asked to look at my green binder. He never once walked the water main route or inspected the pump stations. Not once. But he was busy. I know that because I started getting emails. The first one came on day 4. It was a request for a detailed breakdown of every emergency repair I had authorized over the past 12 months, including parts costs, labor hours, and justification memos. I spent an entire evening compiling it. It was 47 pages long. 47 pages of me keeping the base from falling apart. The second email came on day 6. It was a request for the qualifications and certifications of every member of my team. I sent those over too. Every one of my 4 soldiers had their basic certifications, but none of them were senior qualified. None of them had more than 3 years of experience. That's not a knock on them. They were good kids. They worked hard, but they were junior. They could handle routine maintenance under my supervision. They could not independently diagnose and repair the kind of complex, interconnected, ancient systems that Fort Granger ran on. That required decades of experience. That required me. The third email came on day 9, and it was the one that made my blood run cold. It was a CC. He had sent an email to the Garrison Resource Management Office requesting a cost comparison between maintaining my current team's staffing level and outsourcing all utilities maintenance to a civilian contractor. He had CC'd me on it almost as an afterthought. That night, I called Chief Delgado at Fort Liberty. I told him what was happening. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then he said, Dan, listen to me. Document everything, every email, every conversation, every recommendation you make. Put it in writing, because that kid is about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life, and when the investigation starts, you need to be bulletproof. I took his advice. From that moment on, every single interaction I had with Lieutenant Ashford was documented. Every word, every recommendation, every warning. All of it went into a memorandum for record, signed, dated, and filed. I had been in the Army long enough to know that when things go wrong, and they were absolutely going to go wrong, the first thing leadership does is look for someone to blame. It was not going to be me. Day 12 was when it all came to a head. I was summoned to Lieutenant Ashford's office at 0800. When I walked in, he was sitting behind his desk with a laptop open and a stack of printed spreadsheets arranged in neat piles. There were 2 chairs in front of the desk. One was empty. In the other sat a civilian I had never seen before. He was a heavyset man in khaki pants and a blue polo shirt with a logo on the chest that read Pinnacle Facilities Solutions. He had a laminated binder in his lap and the smile of a man who already knew he had the contract. Sergeant Kowalski, have a seat, Lieutenant Ashford said. I sat down. He didn't waste time. I've completed my assessment of the utilities maintenance operation. I've identified several areas where we can achieve significant cost savings without impacting mission readiness. He slid a spreadsheet across the desk toward me. I picked it up. It was a side-by-side comparison. On the left column was the current cost of my team, my salary, my soldier salaries, benefits, training costs, parts budget, emergency repair fund. On the right column was a quote from Pinnacle Facilities, Solutions for a Full Service Utilities Maintenance Contract. The civilian contractor's quote was cheaper, about $800 a month cheaper. I looked at the spreadsheet. I looked at the civilian. I looked at the lieutenant. Sir, I said, may I speak freely? Oh, go ahead. This comparison is not accurate. It doesn't account for emergency response time. My team lives on or near this installation. When a main breaks at 2 in the morning, I'm on site in 15 minutes. A civilian contractor based out of Macon is going to take an hour minimum, probably more. It also doesn't account for institutional knowledge. I know this basis systems. I know where every valve is. I know which pipes are original 1950s cast iron and which ones were replaced with PVC in the 90s. I know which sections are at risk of failure and which ones are stable. That knowledge cannot be transferred in a briefing or written into a contract. The civilian shifted in his chair. I could feel him wanting to interrupt, but he stayed quiet. I continued. Furthermore, sir, I looked up Pinnacle Facility Solutions last night after I saw your email. They're a general facilities company. They do HVACs, janitorial, grounds maintenance, and basic plumbing for commercial properties. They have no experience with military installations. They have no experience with legacy infrastructure systems. And with respect, sir, Fort Granger's plumbing is not basic. It is a 70-year-old network of interconnected systems that were modified dozens of times without proper documentation. Handing that to a company that services strip malls and office parks would be like asking a dentist to perform heart surgery because they're both doctors. There was silence in the room. The civilian's smile had faded slightly. Lieutenant Ashford stared at me for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something that I will never forget for as long as I live. Sergeant Kowalski, I appreciate your passion, but I think you're overestimating the complexity of what you do. At the end of the day, plumbing is plumbing. Water goes in, water goes out. Pipes are pipes. The Army doesn't need a 22-year specialist to turn a wrench. I can have 3 privates trained up on basic repairs within a month, and Pinnacle can handle anything beyond that. This is about efficiency. This is about being responsible stewards of taxpayer money. I felt my jaw tighten. I took a breath. Sir, I strongly recommend against this course of action. I am formally advising you, on the record, that reducing or eliminating the organic utilities maintenance capability at this installation poses a significant risk to mission readiness and infrastructure integrity. I would like this recommendation entered into the official record. He blinked. Then he said, noted. He picked up a piece of paper from his desk and handed it to me. It was a memorandum. I read it. Effective in 14 days, my team was being reorganized. 2 of my 4 soldiers were being reassigned to the grounds maintenance section. The other 2 would remain in utilities, but would report directly to the Pinnacle site supervisor, not to me. My role was being transitioned to an advisory capacity, meaning I would be available for consultation, but would no longer have direct operational authority over any utilities systems. I was being sidelined, not removed from the base, not reassigned, not chaptered out. Just pushed to the side, made irrelevant. It was worse than being fired because I would still be there. I would still see everything happening. I just wouldn't be allowed to do anything about it. I looked at Lieutenant Ashford. He was watching me, waiting for a reaction. I think he expected me to argue, to yell, to slam my fist on the desk. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Understood, sir, I said. I'll begin transitioning my duties immediately. I assume you'll want my infrastructure notes and repair logs transferred to the Pinnacle team. That would be helpful. Yes, I nodded. I stood up. I walked out. I went back to my shop. I sat down at my desk, and I opened a fresh memorandum for record template on my computer. I typed up every single word of that conversation from memory. Every word. I printed it. I signed it. I dated it. I had specialist Rivera witness it. I filed the original in my personal records and made 3 copies. Then I took my green binder, the one with 22 years of hand-drawn infrastructure maps and repair notes, the only accurate guide to Fort Granger's underground utilities, and I locked it in my personal wall locker in my own post housing. Because here's the thing, that binder was mine. I had created it on my own time, with my own materials over the course of more than 2 decades. It was not government property. It was not in any army system. It was personal notes. And if Lieutenant Ashford wanted to know where the shut-off valve for the Building 12 hot water loop was, he could check the official blueprints. The ones that were wrong. The Pinnacle team arrived the following Monday. There were 3 of them. The site supervisor was a man named Gary, who had a master plumber's license from the state of Georgia, which sounds impressive until you realize that a state plumbing license covers residential and commercial systems. It does not cover military, grade steam distribution networks, pressurized fire suppression loops connected to 40-year-old ANSO systems, or a sewage lift station that was manufactured by a company that went out of business in 1978 and for which replacement parts had to be custom machined by a specialty shop in Ohio. Gary's 2 technicians were journeymen, decent enough guys who knew their way around a bathroom renovation. They had never seen a utility tunnel. They had never worked on a system where the water pressure was managed by a series of pressure reducing valves that had to be adjusted in a specific sequence, or you'd get a water hammer effect powerful enough to crack a pipe joint 3 buildings away. I showed Gary around on his first day. I was professional. I was thorough. I showed him the pump stations, the main shut-off locations, the boiler rooms. I answered every question he asked, but I only answered what he asked. He didn't ask about the quirks. He didn't ask about the workarounds. He didn't ask about the pressure sequence. He didn't ask about the valve under Building 30, one that looked like a standard gate valve, but was actually a modified butterfly valve that had to be turned counterclockwise first, then clockwise, because the stem was installed backwards in 1982 and nobody ever fixed it. He didn't ask, so I didn't tell. That's not sabotage. That's not dereliction of duty. I had been removed from operational authority. I was in an advisory capacity. I was available for consultation. Nobody consulted me. I sat at my desk in the DPW building. I filed paperwork. I answered the occasional email. I drank coffee. And I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Day 3 of the Pinnacle contract, 7:45 in the morning, I was eating breakfast in my quarters when my phone started buzzing. It was Rivera. Sergeant K, there's water coming up through the floor in the basement of Building 9. Building 9 was the administrative headquarters for the garrison commander, Colonel Patricia Harding. Her office was on the 1st floor, directly above the basement. I put down my coffee. Did you call the Pinnacle team? Yeah, Sergeant. Gary said he's looking at the blueprints, trying to find the shut-off. I closed my eyes. The shut-off for Building 9 was not where the blueprints said it was. The blueprint said it was in a valve box on the north side of the building. In reality, that valve had been abandoned in place in 1991 when the main was rerouted. The actual shut-off was 200 meters away, inside a manhole cover behind the motor pool connected to a branch line that also fed buildings 10 and 11. I knew this because I had personally traced that line with a pipe locator 7 years ago when we had a similar leak. It took me 3 days to find the real path. Gary was not going to find it by looking at a blueprint. Rivera, I'm in an advisory capacity. If the Pinnacle team needs consultation, they can submit a request through the lieutenant. There was a pause. Roger, Sergeant. I hung up. I finished my breakfast. At 09:15, I drove to the DPW building and went to my desk. Through the window, I could see a small lake forming in the parking lot behind Building 9. By 10 o'clock, the water was inside the building, not just the basement anymore. It had come up through the floor drains on the first floor. Colonel Harding's office was flooding. Her aide de camp was carrying boxes of files out the front door. I could see Gary and his two guys running around the outside of the building, opening every valve box they could find, turning things, making it worse. At 10:20, someone turned the wrong valve and the water pressure to building 10 spiked. A pipe joint in the ceiling of the second floor latrine failed. Water began pouring down through the ceiling into the first floor conference room, which happened to be where the garrison's classified document storage was located. I watched from my window. I documented the timeline in my memorandum for record. At 11:05, my desk phone rang. It was Lieutenant Ashford. Sergeant Kowalski, I need you in Building 9 immediately. Sir, I'm currently in an advisory capacity per your memorandum dated. Sergeant, that is an order. Get over here now. Roger, sir. On my way. I drove over. The scene was chaos. There were 2 inches of standing water on the first floor of the garrison headquarters. Soldiers were carrying computers and equipment out of offices. The fire department was there with pumps. Colonel Harding was standing in the parking lot in her dress shoes, which were soaked, with an expression on her face that I can only describe as volcanic. Lieutenant Ashford was standing next to her, pale as a ghost. I walked up and saluted the colonel. Sergeant First Class Kowalski. Ma'am, Utilities NCO, Kowalski, she said, and her voice was terrifyingly calm. Can you stop this water? Yes, Mom. I need about 4 minutes. I walked past him. I walked past Gary, who was standing next to a valve box holding a wrench and looking like a man who had just been asked to defuse a bomb in a language he didn't speak. I walked behind the motor pool. I found the manhole cover. I pried it open with a pry bar from my truck. I climbed down. I found the shut-off valve, the real one, the one that only existed in my green binder and in my memory. I closed it. 3 turns clockwise. The water stopped. I climbed out of the manhole. I walked back to the parking lot. The fire department pumps were already pulling the standing water out. It's shut off, Mom, I said to Colonel Harding. She looked at me. She looked at Lieutenant Ashford. She looked at Gary from Pinnacle Facilities Solutions, who was still holding his wrench next to the wrong valve box. Lieutenant Ashford, she said, my office, 1 hour. And I don't mean my current office, because my current office is under 2 inches of water. I mean whatever room in this installation still has a dry floor. She turned and walked away. Her aide de camp followed, carrying a soggy box of files. The damage assessment took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of engineers, inspectors, and contract specialists crawling through every building that had been affected. The final number was $2.7 million. $2.7 million. The flooding had destroyed the flooring, drywall, and electrical systems in 3 buildings. The classified document storage room had suffered water damage to files that had to be professionally restored or recreated. 6 computers were destroyed. The colonel's personal office required a complete renovation. The sewage backup that occurred when Gary's team accidentally cross-pressurized a waste line, something I didn't even mention yet because the story is already painful enough, resulted in a temporary closure of the Dining 5 facility, number 2, and a health inspection that took 3 days to clear. And the original leak, the one that started the whole cascade, it was a failed gasket on a 50-year-old gate valve, a $35 part. I had that exact gasket in my shop. I had a box of 12 of them because I knew those old valves, and I knew which ones were due for replacement. If I had still been in my operational role, I would have caught the early signs of that failure a week before it burst. I would have replaced the gasket on a Tuesday afternoon. It would have taken 45 minutes. Nobody would have even noticed. Instead, it cost $2.7 million, the temporary displacement of the garrison headquarters, a formal investigation by the Inspector General, and the complete termination of the Pinnacle Facilities solutions contract after only 72 hours of active service. Lieutenant Ashford received a general officer memorandum of reprimand, which, for those of you who don't know military administrative actions, is essentially a career death sentence for an officer. A GOMAR in your file means you will never be promoted again. His military career was over before his first officer evaluation report was even due. He also received a formal counseling for failure to heed the advice of a senior non-commissioned officer, something that is literally drilled into every officer candidate's head from day one of their training. The relationship between officers and NCOs is the backbone of the United States Army. Officers lead, NCOs execute. When an officer ignores the expertise of a senior NCO, bad things happen. In this case, $2.7 million worth of bad things. As for me, I was restored to full operational authority within 24 hours of the flood. Colonel Harding personally called me into her temporary office the next morning and told me that my memorandums for record had been reviewed and that my conduct throughout the entire situation had been, and I quote, exactly what I would expect from a senior non-commissioned officer of your caliber. She also approved the full infrastructure survey and digital mapping project that Chief Delgado had been requesting for years. The budget was found almost overnight. Funny how that works. I served 3 more years at Fort Granger before I retired. In that time, I trained 2 junior NCOs to take over my role, and I personally supervised the digital mapping of every single pipe, valve, and junction on the installation. That project took 14 months and cost $300,000. It should have been done 20 years ago, but it took a $2.7 million disaster caused by a 23-year-old lieutenant who thought plumbing was simple for anyone to finally see the value in it. I want to be clear about something. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of what happened. I'm not. Soldiers were inconvenienced. Mission readiness was compromised. Taxpayer money was wasted. None of that needed to happen. I tell this story because it illustrates something that I've seen over and over again in my 22 years of service, and that civilians see in their workplaces every single day. There are people in every organization who keep things running. They're not flashy. They don't have impressive titles. They don't give PowerPoint presentations or attend strategy meetings. They're in the basement. They're in the tunnels. They're under the floor, covered in grease and pipe dope, doing work that nobody notices until it stops getting done. And every so often, someone with authority and no understanding comes along and decides that those people are expendable, that their knowledge is replaceable, that their experience is a luxury rather than a necessity. And every single time, without exception, that decision ends in disaster. Respect the people who keep the water running. Respect the people who keep the lights on. Respect the people who know where the real shut-off valve is. Because when the flood comes, and it always comes, they are the only ones who can make it stop. My name is Dan Kowalski. Sergeant, First Class, United States Army, retired. And I was never just a plumber.